I swear it was just a stiff muscle. That was what the man told himself the first time his fingers brushed the strange swelling at the base of his neck. He had been leaning over his desk too long, he decided. He had carried groceries, he had fallen asleep on the couch, he had done a dozen ordinary things that might have explained an ordinary ache. But each night the ache returned a little heavier, sharper, more precise, as if a small, stubborn fist had formed beneath the skin and tightened with every breath he took. He lived alone in a modest apartment that always smelled faintly of coffee and laundry powder. The man moved carefully in mirrors, wary of what he might see. When he finally rolled his shoulder and turned just right, the swelling looked like a pale knot pushing against the line of his neck. He pressed it once, then again. It gave with a thick, resistant springiness and sent a ribbon of pain toward his ear. For a week, he ignored it. He folded work shirts, washed dishes, ran a bath and tried to sink deeper than the pain. As the days passed, the man stopped sleeping through the night. He began waking before dawn with his jaw clenched and his pillow damp with sweat. At work, he told a colleague that he had pulled something. He tried to laugh when he struggled to turn his head. He kept a bottle of over-the-counter painkillers in his backpack and swallowed them without water beside the vending machine. The headache that had been a shadow became a drumbeat. By the third week, shaving hurt. The skin behind his ear felt tense, the hairline tender, and a throbbing pulse seemed to live inside the swelling. He told himself it would go away. It did not. On a Tuesday that smelled like rain, the man finally stood at the sliding doors of the hospital with his shoulders drawn up against the wind. He didn't like hospitals, few people did. The brightness inside felt too clean, too honest. Nurses glided past with clipboards, shoes whispering against the floor. He checked in, sat in a molded plastic chair, and watched a television mounted high on the wall flicker with a muted morning show. A child cried somewhere down the hall. When a nurse called his name, the man stood and felt the room tilt softly to the left. In triage, the nurse asked him to touch the spot that hurt most. He did, and her eyes narrowed with concentration. She pressed gently, then more firmly, and the man's vision flashed white at the edges. "Tender?" she asked, voice calm. He nodded. "Any fever?" He thought of the nights he had woken sweating and shrugged. The nurse clipped a pulse oximeter to his finger, wrapped a cuff around his arm, tilted her head at the numbers. She led him to an exam room where a doctor with kind eyes and a precise manner stepped in, washed his hands, and introduced himself simply as Dr. H. The man told the doctor the story straight. He had noticed a swelling on the back of his neck. He had ignored it. The pain grew. Dr. H asked the quiet questions that always carved a path to the center. When had it started? What made it worse? Did he have trouble swallowing or any numbness? How were the headaches? Had he lost weight? Had he felt a fever deep in his bones? The doctor examined the swelling with the patience of someone reading a long letter. He traced the borders beneath the skin, followed the path of tender lymph nodes, and tested the man's shoulder strength, his shrug, his ability to turn without flinching. He asked him to say, "E," and pressed lightly along the edge where the neck met the skull. "We'll start with imaging," Dr. H said, gentle but firm. "It may be a cyst, a benign mass, an inflamed lymph node. We need to see it clearly." The man nodded, grateful to be moving forward, terrified of the word mass. In radiology, a technician guided him to lie still. The man's heart hammered, but he did as he was told. The first scan mapped soft tissues, the second showed densities more clearly. He stared up at the ceiling and memorized the perfect grid of tiles, the hairline cracks that ran like rivers through porcelain. He thought of the years he had wasted on things that did not matter and the years he hoped he still had. When it ended, the technician's smile held a practiced warmth that didn't give anything away. "A doctor will come speak with you," she said. He waited in a quiet room that smelled like antiseptic and lemon. The wall clock ticked in polite, insistent steps. When the door opened, Dr. H returned with a tall surgeon in navy scrubs who introduced herself as Dr. Marin. She carried the scans on a tablet, and her voice, while calm, had the gravity of someone who understood that names were anchors and clarity a gift. She said the images showed a complex lesion deep in the soft tissue along the posterior triangle of the neck. It pressed near the accessory nerve and lay close to important vessels. There were cystic components and irregular calcifications. It did not look like a simple swollen node. It did not look like a common lipoma. It demanded respect. "We need to take it out," she said. "Soon. We'll do this in the operating room with a full team. You'll be asleep the whole time." "I know that's a lot to hear in one morning." The man asked the only question that mattered. "Is it cancer?" Dr. Marin held his gaze. "We won't know until pathology analyzes it. Some features look benign. Some are unusual. I won't guess. I will operate with the assumption that nerves and vessels matter more to you than anything else. We'll protect them." Consent felt like stepping off a dock into dark water. The man signed. A nurse placed a wristband around his arm. The world shrank to practicalities: no food, a sip of water, a bag for his clothes, a locker with a key. In pre-op, the anesthesiologist spoke with a gentle cadence, explaining what propofol did and why a breathing tube helped. The man looked at the crisp curtains, the steady dance of monitors, the mechanical sigh of a nearby ventilator. He thought of the way the swelling had changed his posture, how he tilted toward pain and bent around it as if pain owned a corner of his life. He thought of calling his sister and didn't. The force slid into a vein, coolness moved up his arm like a soft frost. The ceiling lights drifted. The operating room had the focused hum of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Drapes framed the field. The man lay face down with careful padding under his chest and forehead, a line of blue ink traced the planned incision. Dr. Marin's voice anchored the room as she reviewed the anatomy, calling out landmarks: the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius, the path of the spinal accessory nerve, the borders of the posterior triangle where surprise could hide. A scrub tech handed instruments with muscle memory. The anesthesiologist adjusted flows, eyes steady on waveforms. Someone announced the time. When the first cut opened the skin, the surgeons expected a bloodless plane to present itself. Instead, a slick, pearly wall bulged under the retractor like the surface of an egg. It glistened with a sheen that didn't belong to an ordinary cyst. Dr. Marin paused, recalibrated, lifted with exquisite restraint. A strange filament clung to the forceps, fine, dark, unmistakable. Hair. A breath tightened the room and then released. She widened the exposure in measured millimeters. Within the capsule, cartilage gleamed with a faint, uncanny smoothness. Behind it, a chalky nub protruded like a tiny knuckle. A tooth bud, or something very much like one, had developed where no tooth should have lived. The surgeons did not speak for a beat. Then Dr. Marin's voice returned, even and precise. "We're seeing a complex mass with mature elements: keratin, hair, cartilage, calcified structures. This looks like a mature teratoma." The words landed like a book closing gently. Rare, but real. Not a nightmare invented to scare families. Something that happened, sometimes, where cells lost the thread of what they should become and built a small, private confusion out of pieces meant for somewhere else. They proceeded like climbers in fog. The capsule adhered to fascia near the nerve, the team dissected it free with patient strokes, respecting the nerve's subtle twitch, the vessel's quiet threat beneath. The man lay perfectly still under anesthesia while strangers protected parts of him he never thought about. The mass came away whole, weighty, lopsided, sealed. They irrigated. They checked for bleeding. They preserved every function they could. Sutures marched the incision closed in small, meticulous steps, and a sterile dressing erased the work from sight. Hours later, the man woke beneath a thin hospital blanket with the ordinary miracle of breath moving easily and pain purring at a tolerable volume behind his ear and down his neck. The room was dim except for a narrow bar of light that spilled from the hallway. A nurse appeared in that light and smiled the way people smile at someone who had already climbed a difficult hill. She asked his name, the day, what hurt, and how much. He touched the dressing as if it might disappear. Even through gauze and tape, he felt a flatness where the swelling had once pushed. The man whispered thank you to no one in particular. Dr. H visited first, then Dr. Marin. They stood at his bedside with their hands folded over clipboards and their faces open in calm. Dr. Marin explained what they had found in the most human language she had. The mass looked like a mature teratoma, a tumor made of fully developed tissues that didn't belong in the neck. Hair. Cartilage. A calcified bit that could have passed for a tooth. She said these tumors were rare in that location and even rarer in adults. It had likely grown slowly for years, quietly, until inflammation or infection had woken it. It was unlike anything we see in a routine case, she said, not to scare him but to honor the truth. Pathology will confirm. What matters right now is that we removed it completely and protected your nerves. Lift your shoulders for me. The man shrugged, surprised by how ordinary the motion felt. She nodded, satisfied, and told him the signs to watch for: fever, sudden swelling, drainage, numbness. She told him he would leave with antibiotics and pain medication and the number to call if anything worried him. He listened as if memorizing the route out of a dark neighborhood. When she left, the room folded into a softer quiet. The man stared at the ceiling and saw the operating room again, though he hadn't seen it while it was happening. He imagined the hair, the cartilage, the small tooth-like nub glinting under lights. His stomach turned and settled. He thought of all the stories people told about bodies keeping secrets: a swallowed pin found years later, a bullet lodged close to the heart, a stone growing in a kidney. But this had been his secret, heavy and silent in his neck, shaping his posture and his days without his permission. He dozed, woke, ate a small cup of applesauce that tasted like school cafeterias in autumn, and dozed again. By evening, the ward changed tempo. Dinner carts rattled and went quiet. Distant televisions played a game whose rules he didn't know. Footsteps softened. A patient down the hall laughed once, surprised. The man shifted carefully and found a position that didn't hurt. He lifted his phone and hovered over his sister's name. He thought of what to say. I had surgery and they found hair and cartilage in my neck, sounded like a bad joke. He set the phone down and let the room expand again. Night in the hospital ran long and uncomplicated. A nurse checked his vitals and the dressing, murmured encouragement, and recorded numbers with the tidy attention of someone who believed details were a kind of kindness. The man drifted between sleep and the gentle ache that tugged at the edge of awareness. When he woke after midnight, he listened to the metal sigh of the radiator, the hum of the air system, the faraway elevator doors opening and closing. He felt both saved and unsettled, buoyed by the fact of being alive and haunted by the notion that a part of him had been built of fragments that belonged nowhere near his neck. Morning brought coffee and sunlight. Dr. H returned with the first preliminary note from pathology: features consistent with a mature teratoma, no malignancy seen on initial sections, full report to follow. The man exhaled and realized he had been breathing in installments. He nodded until nodding hurt and then smiled without moving his neck at all. The man, grateful and bewildered, let the relief spread to places that had been clenched for weeks. He signed discharge papers with a slow, careful script that had not changed since he was a teenager. He stepped into the world with a scarf wrapped loosely around the dressing and the sense that life had been rearranged by hands he might never see again. Outside, the air felt new. He walked home a little crooked, a little tired, carrying a small plastic bag with medications and a sheet of instructions that insisted on rest, hygiene, and follow-up. He placed the bag on his kitchen table beside a bowl of oranges that he had avoided because chewing had hurt. He stood for a long minute with his palms against the table, breathing. Neighbors would ask how he was. Co-workers would make jokes because jokes made strange things easier. He would nod and keep some details to himself. The man washed his hands, changed the gauze as he had been shown, and caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The swelling no longer distorted the line of his neck. A straight length of tape floated like a pale river under his hairline. He tilted his head, smiled with the cautious delight of someone testing a new hinge, and then stopped before the ache sharpened. That afternoon, he sat by the window, answered 3 messages with simple sentences, and watched a pair of sparrows bicker on the fire escape. He had been given back the ordinary privileges of turning his head and sleeping on his side. He sipped water. He swallowed the antibiotic and the pain pill. He returned to the thought he could not shake. The surgeons had opened the back of his neck and found a small biography written in tissues that weren't supposed to be there. That story lived with him now. He did not know what it meant yet, but he knew it would follow him the way a scar followed the path of a blade. Days later, on his first follow-up, the man walked the hospital corridor slower than he liked and faster than he feared he could. The receptionist remembered him and smiled with her eyes. The elevator breathed them all up one floor. In clinic, he waited while a toddler in a tiny puffer jacket stared at his bandage and whispered to his mother. When Dr. Marin stepped in, she peeled back the dressing with gentle fingers and made a pleased sound that people made when a wound cooperated. She read the final pathology report aloud in a steady cadence: mature teratoma, no malignant components identified, margins clear. She explained, again, what that meant in terms that respected both the science and the man who had to live with it. He asked questions he had written on a folded scrap of paper. She answered all of them and a few he hadn't thought to ask. On the walk home, the man noticed the city with an attention he had not paid it in months. He saw the way a bicycle tire chewed a puddle into lace. He saw steam lifting from a bakery vent like a ghost that preferred mornings. He saw a woman in a green coat laugh into her scarf and a dog refuse to go anywhere but backward. He reached up, touched the spot carefully, and let his hand fall. The pain had faded to a memory that still pulsed sometimes, like a song heard through a wall. He crossed the street on a yellow light and did not run. That night, sleep came easier. The nightmare that had woken him 2 nights in a row, the impossible image of hair coiled in darkness, unwound into something gentler. The man understood that fear always wrote its own script, and he did not have to read every line. He lay on his side, feeling the cool weight of the pillow against his cheek, and let his chest move like a slow tide. The man knew this was not the end of the story. It could not be, not after what had been inside him and what had been taken out. There were follow-ups ahead, and there were days when a twinge would make him stand very still in a doorway. There were conversations he had not yet had, with a sister who loved to worry and a friend who would listen without trying to fix anything. There were mornings he would touch the scar and remember the surgeons freezing in shock, the way the room must have held its breath as something strange and real appeared under those lights. There were afternoons when he would forget the entire thing for hours at a time and then remember suddenly, like catching his reflection in a window and not recognizing himself for a heartbeat. And there was a life, a narrower, sharper kind of gratitude, that waited for him each time he turned his head and found, to his astonishment, that it no longer hurt. Plus, he woke late the next morning with the ordinary courage of someone who had errands to run. The man eased out of bed, reached for the glass of water, and felt the tug of healing skin along the back of his neck, a quiet reminder that his body had been opened and closed with care. He stood at the bathroom mirror and studied the incision the way people studied weather, trying to read what might come next. The edges looked clean, a faint ridge under a pale tape line that ran just beneath his hairline. He dabbed around it with sterile gauze as instructed, patted it dry, and thought of the way Dr. Marin had said margins clear, with a relieved exhale that he hadn't realized he needed to hear. He texted his manager 2 sentences that revealed almost nothing: surgery went okay. I'll be out a bit longer. The reply came back with a thumbs up and a promise to shift a few tasks. He stared at the phone and then scrolled to his sister's name again. He typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, he sent, I had to have a mass removed from my neck. It wasn't cancer. I'm okay. Her response arrived as if she had been waiting by the phone for months without daring to say so. She asked for details, asked if she should come, asked if he had eaten. He answered in a string of short messages, careful not to let any of them turn into a plea for company he wasn't yet sure he wanted. In the kitchen, sunlight painted a rectangle across the table, and dust drifted lazily through it like thoughts he hadn't sorted. The man brewed coffee and realized that the smell alone could make him feel anchored. He took the first sip and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He cut an orange in half and ate it over the sink, the juice bright and insistent, and tried to remember the last time chewing didn't hurt. Small victories, he reminded himself. Being able to tilt his head even a few degrees without that old, deep pull felt like a door opening. He set a chair by the window and carried over a folder the hospital had given him, discharge papers, medication instructions, a follow-up schedule, a pamphlet about incision care, and a stapled packet with the unromantic title, Understanding Your Pathology Report. He read slowly. The language was clinical but honest. It explained how cells that should have specialized neatly had instead formed a collection of already formed tissues, skin, hair, cartilage, wrapped in a capsule, the way a body sometimes tried to solve a problem by hiding it from itself. He traced the phrase, mature teratoma, with his eyes until it softened from a threat into a fact. The man, who had spent weeks pretending nothing was wrong, now found an odd comfort in specificity. That afternoon, he shuffled to the pharmacy for a refill and bought a soft cotton scarf in a muted gray from the shop next door. The air outside carried a clean chill, and the scarf lay lightly against the bandage as if it had been designed for exactly that purpose. He passed a cafe where people sat facing the street, heads tilted down over screens, and felt, for the first time in months, that he could join them without scanning for a place where the light wouldn't expose the swelling that had defined his posture. He didn't go in. Not yet. He promised himself he would, on another day, when his hand didn't instinctively rise to check the dressing every few minutes. Sleep settled differently over the next few nights. He still woke from time to a dream that wasn't quite a nightmare, an operating room with faces he couldn't see, a glint of metal, a whisper of hair that had never belonged in the back of his neck, but the panic softened, and when he sat up, the room offered him ordinary shapes, the dresser, the chair with the jacket slung over it, the rectangle of city light along the wall. He learned to press his palm lightly along the mattress and steady his breath until the present asserted itself again. He kept a notebook on the nightstand and wrote down the things the man wanted to remember when morning returned: call clinic if redness spreads. Keep wound dry. Don't lift. Be patient. On the third day, Dr. H called to ask how the man was managing at home. The check-in felt both professional and kind, and the man was surprised by how much it helped to describe his pain on a scale and hear someone say that his numbers made sense. They talked about shoulder rolls and gentle stretches to keep stiffness from staking a claim, about the accessory nerve's path and why shrugging without pain felt like a small victory worth celebrating. Before hanging up, Dr. H reminded him of the next appointment and added, almost as an afterthought, "You did the right thing by coming in when you did." The man held on to that sentence longer than he expected. When he finally returned to work part-time, the office looked exactly as it always had, potted plant drooping in the same corner, printer jam light blinking with stubborn optimism, the same humming strip lights that made people look paler than they were. The man slid into his chair and noticed, with an electric flicker of relief, that turning his head toward a voice no longer sent pain like a knife under his ear. Colleagues approached with the unsteady good cheer people used when the subject could have been serious. He gave them the version of the story that fit in a hallway: he had a rare benign tumor, there had been surgery, it had gone well, he had a scar and a prescription for ibuprofen. They nodded and did what people did, asked how he felt, pressed lips together, reached for a comparison from a cousin or a news story, then pivoted gently back to deadlines. At lunch, he found himself alone by the window and sent his sister a photo of the pale tape line, careful to crop it so it didn't shock her. She replied with a heart and a series of exclamation points and a, "When can I call?" He typed, "Tonight," and felt a small anticipation that startled him. When evening came, they spoke without rushing, filling the pauses with the soft rustle of kitchens in two different apartments. She asked what it had looked like. He told her the truth as he had received it: hair, cartilage, a calcified nub that resembled a tooth. She made a disbelieving sound that turned quickly into tears. He listened to her cry without trying to talk her out of it. When she steadied, she said, "I'm just glad you're here." He said he was, too, and discovered that saying it out loud helped him believe it. The man began to keep small promises to himself. He walked an extra block each day. He practiced turning his head a fraction farther while standing in line at the grocery store. He cooked something that required chopping and smiled when the motion tugged but didn't punish. He changed the dressing with clean hands and an attention that bordered on reverence. He set alarms for his antibiotics and snapped the pill bottle lids closed with a satisfaction that felt like progress. He sat on the park bench where he used to avoid sitting because the angle of the light had made the swelling impossible to ignore. The bench faced a strip of grass where dogs invented their own games, and the laughter of strangers felt like a language he could understand again. When his follow-up day arrived, he carried a neat list of questions in his wallet like a schoolboy at an oral exam. In the clinic room, Dr. Marin examined the incision and nodded with that focused pleasure surgeons had when healing obeyed the rules. He asked whether the teratoma could return. She answered plainly, they had removed the mass with clear margins, and while nothing in medicine came with a guarantee, the likelihood of recurrence after a complete excision like his was low. He asked if he had done something to cause it and watched relief appear on her face as she shook her head. "No," she said, "sometimes cells take a wrong path long before we meet them, and we only notice when the body calls attention to it." He asked about the twinges that showed up without warning. She explained nerves waking up and scar tissue reorganizing, how the body remodeled itself with a patience people rarely granted themselves. Before he left, the nurse showed him gentle stretches for his neck and shoulder girdle, small circles, slow turns, the kind of movements that reminded joints they had options. He practiced them in front of the mirrored cabinet, his reflection tentative but willing. He scheduled another check-in for a few months out and tucked the appointment card into his pocket like a ticket to a place where certainty lived. Back home, the man sat at his table with the Understanding Your Pathology report still open and started writing his own report on the days since surgery. He wrote about the way the morning light had returned to its old softness on his walls, about how coffee had reclaimed its place as a signal that the day belonged to him, about how the city seemed to have learned a new way to breathe. He wrote that being told the surgeons had frozen in shock during the operation made sense to him because he had lived with that shock afterward. He had felt it in the quiet moments when his mind tried to redraw the map of his body and found a scar where the swelling used to be. He wrote that the man who had ignored the pain because it felt easier had given way to the man who read instruction sheets and made follow-up calls and wrapped a scarf not to hide but to protect. He found himself more patient with lines, with slow walkers, with the clatter of a dropped spoon in a cafe. The man noticed how often people touched the backs of their necks when thinking, and how, for the first time in weeks, he could rest his hand there without flinching. He began to recognize a particular fatigue that came not from work but from healing, and he learned to lie down before it asked loudly. On the bus, he stood when he could have asked for a seat, not to prove anything, but because the soft sway felt like a lesson in balance he wanted to relearn. The scar itched as scars did when nerves negotiated new terms. He took that itch as a good sign and resisted the old habit of scratching away at what he didn't understand. When he accidentally caught sight of the line under harsh elevator lighting, he reminded himself that every person beside him carried marks invisible from the outside, stitches that were emotional, calcifications that were choices, small cysts of regret that would never meet a scalpel. The man lived a little slower and a little truer to the advice people gave and rarely followed: listen, hydrate, stretch, call someone back. A week later, his sister arrived with a bag of groceries and the kind of fussing that made him laugh. They cooked together, and he noticed how naturally she moved around his kitchen, how she reached for the right drawer without thinking. Over dinner, she asked if he wanted to see something, then showed him an article she had found explaining teratomas in plain language. He read it and felt relief that someone had made a map of the thing that had lived inside him. He also felt the boundary where learning had to end for the day, and he folded the page gently and said, "Thank you," because he understood that the offer mattered more than the facts themselves. When she left, the apartment smelled like garlic and lemon and steam. He stood in that warm, ordinary air and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with scans or pathology, that the story the man was living now depended not just on what had been cut out but on what he was willing to let in. He let in the inconvenience of slowness and the small embarrassment of accepting help. He let in the steadying rhythm of scheduled follow-ups and the odd kindness of strangers who made room for him without knowing why. On a rain-bright Saturday, the man took the long way to the market. He paused at a storefront window and saw himself as someone would who didn't know his story, a man wearing a gray scarf, shoulders more level than they had been in months, eyes taking in the world with a calm he had earned. He touched the place where the swelling had once ruled his days and found only the ridge of a thin, healing line. He smiled, remembering how the surgeons had paused over the mass, how the room had gone still, how professionalism had met surprise and chosen precision. He thought of the phrase, unlike anything they had ever seen, and realized that every life contained a moment like that, a revelation that rearranged what came after. He went home with a paper bag full of apples and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. He sliced a heel and ate it standing up, the crust crisp against his teeth, and felt a gratitude so physical it bordered on hunger. He sat down with a pen, opened his notebook, and wrote the sentence he wanted to carry into the next difficulty. When it mattered, I went, and they helped me. The man underlined it once, closed the notebook, and rested his hand on it like a promise he intended to keep. On the next clinic day, the waiting room felt less like a place where news was delivered and more like a place where work was done, the work of healing, of measuring, of asking questions and answering honestly even when the answer was, I don't know yet. The medical assistant took his vitals and smiled when the numbers landed in the right ranges. The man sat, listening to the soft shuffle of slippers on linoleum and the click of keyboards, and felt a swell of appreciation for routines that rarely made headlines but saved lives every day. When Dr. Marin entered, the man greeted her with the ease reserved for people who had seen him at his most vulnerable and chosen to be careful with him. She asked him to turn his head left, then right, to shrug, to resist pressure against her hand. He did each movement and tracked, with a nearly scientific curiosity, which angles were smooth and which carried a whisper of resistance. She reviewed the plan, one more follow-up to confirm the scar matured well, continued stretching, awareness of signs that would warrant a call. Before he left, he asked a question that had been tapping at the edge of his thoughts. Why did it feel like part of my identity changed when you told me what it was? She considered this, then said, sometimes a name gives shape to fear, and once fear has a shape, it has edges. Edges are something we can work with. He walked out into a sky so high it made the buildings look provisional, and he let the day unfold without arranging it. The man stopped for coffee and sat facing the street at last. He didn't pull the scarf higher to hide the line behind his ear. He watched strangers passing with the affectionate interest of someone returning from a private storm. He didn't try to make meaning out of everything, he let some things be what they were, a warm cup, a good chair, a city counting down a traffic light. That evening, he pulled a photo album from the shelf, one of the few he had kept through moves and seasons, and leafed through the thick pages with a slow thumb. He looked at the portrait someone had taken of him years ago, shoulders square, head turned slightly toward a laugh just out of frame. He traced the outline of his younger self and felt no urge to measure the distance between then and now. He closed the book and returned it to the shelf, satisfied by the soft thump it made as it settled into place. In the weeks that followed, the man started noticing other people's scars the way people who recovered from a storm learn to read the skyline for weather. A cashier with a thin silver line along her knuckle, a runner with a crescent on his knee, a friend with a seam near his eyebrow that told the story of a childhood fall. He didn't tell them his story unless he was asked, and when he was, he told it the way he had lived it, ordinary day by ordinary day, with fear and relief braided together in a rope that held. He described the swelling on the back of his neck in the mornings when turning his head felt like betrayal, the hospital hallway and the way Dr. H's questions had built a careful map, the operating room and the moment the surgeons froze over something that didn't belong, the first breath afterward that felt entirely his. One quiet night, sitting by the window with a book he wasn't reading, the man realized that the ghost of the swelling had finally stopped whispering. In its place, there was a space that invited different things, attention that wasn't dread, gratitude that wasn't frantic. He closed his eyes and might have slept if the phone hadn't vibrated with a message from his sister, a photo of her porch plants thriving against all odds. "Look," she wrote, "these came back after I thought they were gone." He smiled at the coincidence that wasn't a coincidence at all and typed back, "Good. Keep watering." He left the phone face down, stood, and stretched the way the nurse had taught him, chin to one shoulder, then the other, a gentle roll that asked nothing more than patience. The man felt the pull of scar and the generosity of muscle giving way, and he understood, as clearly as he had understood anything in months, that this was how it would go: attention, adjustment, repetition, the practice of living with what had happened without letting it own the room. He breathed in. He breathed out. He listened to the house settle, to the city breathe, to the quiet assurance that he could turn his head now and not meet pain first. "Tell me exactly what you felt when you first noticed it," the physical therapist asked, and the man surprised himself by answering in a rush. He described the first tug under the skin, the stubborn knot at the back of his neck, the way the world narrowed to a point of pain whenever he turned too quickly. The therapist, a calm woman with patient hands, nodded and pressed 2 fingers into the trapezius with the kind of precision the man recognized from the hospital. She showed him how the spinal accessory nerve influenced his shoulder mechanics, how one wrong flinch months ago might have taught his body a crooked lesson. The man learned to raise his arm without bracing. He learned to place his hand on the wall and let the shoulder blade glide instead of clamp. He learned to wait for ease instead of forcing it. 10 seconds became 30, then a minute. The exercises looked embarrassingly small and felt impossibly large. On the bus home, the man noticed how many people guarded injuries you couldn't see. A teenager cupped his wrist as if protecting a secret. A woman massaged the bridge of her nose under flickering lights. The man rolled his shoulders once, twice, grateful that the movement no longer sent pain like a blade under his ear. He leaned his head against the window carefully, feeling the cool glass through the scarf, and watched the city drift past in a series of reflections he didn't try to interpret. That evening, the man set a timer and cooked a simple meal, pausing to stretch when heat rose from the pan and made the room feel too fast. He had spent weeks measuring days by pain, now he measured them by what returned. He could carry a light bag of groceries. He could lie on his left side. He could turn to answer when someone called his name without planning the turn in advance. After dinner, he took out the plain envelope that held the final pathology report and read it again as if it were a letter from another version of himself. Mature teratoma. Margins clear. No malignant features identified. A sentence at the end, clinical correlation recommended, made him smile, as if the man hadn't lived the clinical correlation day by day. He slept better. He dreamed simpler. Once, he dreamed he was standing at the edge of the operating room, a visitor who wasn't allowed to speak. In the dream, the surgeons leaned forward and a bright, impossible object flashed under the light, then the image folded itself into a clean white square and disappeared. He woke gentle, not gasping, and realized that even his dreams had learned to turn their faces toward steadiness. The next morning, the man walked to the cafe he had avoided. He ordered coffee and took a seat with his back to the wall, not out of fear but out of habit. He opened his notebook and wrote down the precise way the cup warmed his palms, the precise way the chair supported his shoulder blades, the precise way light angled through the window onto the table. He wrote because writing returned his attention to the world's ordinary mercies. When his phone buzzed, he saw a message from an unknown number. It was the hospital billing office, not unkind, asking if he had questions. He did. The man called back and listened to the gentle math of his care turned into numbers and dates. He asked about itemized charges and was surprised at the relief he felt when a human voice explained how anesthesia time was counted, how pathology coded slides, how the operating room tracked minutes like currency. The man wrote everything down. Clarity helped. At work, a deadline pressed close. The man sat with a colleague named Javier who had once run marathons and now walked with a knee brace after a trail misstep. They worked in companionable quiet until Javier asked, without looking up, "You okay?" The man considered the complicated truth and opted for a version that didn't skip the wait. Better, he said. And different. Javier nodded like a man who understood that changing isn't always a loss. He told the man about the first time he trusted his knee on stairs again, how he had paused on the landing afterward and cried harder than he expected to. The man, who had found himself near tears the first time he shrugged without pain, understood completely. On a late afternoon that smelled like rain on concrete, the man returned to the hospital for a routine wound check. The hallway looked smaller than he remembered, less like a canyon of worry, more like a place where people did their jobs. A volunteer with a bright vest and a quiet smile offered directions he didn't need, and the man thanked her anyway. In the exam room, Dr. H stepped in with a file and a greeting that landed exactly between professional and personal. He examined the scar, asked about numbness and tingling, tested the man's shoulder again. "You're healing well," he said, then added, "How's the mind doing with what we found?" The man surprised himself by answering plainly. "It haunted me," he said. "Less now. But I think about it when I shower or when the light hits the mirror just right." Dr. H nodded. "That's normal. The body remembers in flashes. So does the mind. It fades." On the way out, the man took a detour past the radiology waiting area where he had first stared at ceiling tiles and thought about time. A couple sat with their hands folded so tightly their knuckles blanched, and the man felt, not pity, but kinship. He didn't interrupt their private weather. He simply left a small gesture behind. He turned his chair back under the magazine's table where someone had left it askew, a tiny act of order that felt like respect. The man's sister visited again and brought something the man hadn't known he wanted, a scar cream with a faint, clean smell and a list of ingredients she had researched with a ferocity that only siblings mastered. They sat at the table and compared minimal routines. She teased him for lining up his pill bottles like soldiers. He teased her for taping reminders to her fridge. Then the teasing gave way to silence of the best kind. She asked, eventually, when he had first realized he couldn't ignore the swelling anymore. The man looked down at his hands and said, "The night I couldn't find a position that didn't hurt. It felt like someone else had taken the controls." She reached across the table and set her palm over his knuckles, the way you steady a cup that's still warm. In physical therapy, the man graduated to resistance bands that looked like ribbon and felt like wire. He learned that strength returned as quietly as it had left. The therapist watched his form like a hawk and praised small corrections that would have escaped anyone else. "See how your shoulder blade moves now?" she asked as he pulled. He did see. He also felt the odd, sudden sting that came when scar tissue let go, a bright pinprick from deep inside. He held still and breathed through it. The therapist nodded. "That's the body reorganizing the story." At home, the man cleaned a closet he had avoided. He found a scarf he had bought years before and a stack of old appointment cards from a dentist who had retired. He found an unopened envelope with a photo someone had mailed him and forgotten to mention. It showed the man at a picnic, head thrown back, the clean line of his neck easily visible in sunlight. He studied that old, simple line for a long moment, not to mourn it, but to honor the span between then and now. He slipped the photo into the album and wrote the date on the back as if he were filing evidence for a case he had finally learned how to argue in his own favor. One damp morning, the man woke with the first fever he'd had since surgery. It was small, barely more than a persuasion, but it set old alarms ringing in his chest. He checked the incision, no angry red, no heat at the site, no drainage. He checked the numbers he had pinned to the fridge and saw the clinic's number there like a life raft. He called. A nurse asked methodical questions and concluded it was likely a garden variety cold, not a complication. "But you did the right thing by calling," she said, and the man felt that sentence land in the same quiet, private place where Dr. H's "you came in when it mattered" lived. Illness changed the world's scale. The man made tea and watched steam curl up like a thought losing its urgency. He lay on the couch with a blanket and allowed himself to be tired without making meaning out of it. For once, he didn't go looking for wave patterns in the ceiling. He took a nap that felt like dropping a bag he had carried too far and woke to text messages he didn't answer immediately. He let the day pass at the speed of breath. When the cold cleared, he returned to the market and stood in the aisle where bandages lived. He picked up a new box of sterile strips and almost laughed at how quickly a person could become fluent in languages he never wanted to learn: adhesive removal, silicone sheeting, scar massage. He thought of all the words he had looked up in the past weeks and how each one had traveled from threat to tool as soon as he understood it. He bought the strips and, on impulse, a small plant with glossy leaves that looked like they understood survival. At the next follow-up, the man sat across from Dr. Marin and asked the question he had been carrying in different shapes. "If I had waited another month," he said, "what would have happened?" Dr. Marin considered this with a care that made him trust whatever answer came. "Most likely," she said, "more pain, more inflammation, possibly an infection, possibly more complicated surgery." "You didn't wait. You came. That choice changed the rest." The man sat with that, feeling the weight of a door he hadn't let close. He began to volunteer 2 hours a week at the hospital, a quiet task that suited him, guiding people from the entrance to the right elevator, pointing toward radiology with a map he had carried in his body for months. He learned which chairs were most comfortable for long waits. He learned how to offer help without intruding on the choreography of worry. "Can I walk you there? Do you want water? The cafe is down that hall if you need a break." He saw, again and again, the moment a name on a schedule turned into a person in a hallway, and he resolved, each time, to treat that moment like a fragile thing. The man kept his routines because routines held. He stretched in the morning while the kettle sang. He walked after lunch even when the sky threatened rain. He read the same paragraph twice if his mind fled and called it progress to notice the fleeing. He replaced the gray scarf with a thinner one not because he wanted to hide but because he liked the way it felt against the healing line. He caught his reflection in a storefront and saw a man who had learned to tilt toward care instead of away from it. On a Sunday, he met an old friend for a late breakfast. They had not seen each other since before the surgery, and the friend arrived with the anxiety of someone who had checked his phone too often. He reached across the table, gripped the man's forearm, and asked if he could ask about the operation. The man told him, the way he told it now, the swelling at the back of his neck, the weeks of denial, the hospital's bright honesty, the operating room's stillness when the mask gave up its secret, the relief of clear margins. The friend listened, eyes bright, then told his own story, quieter, but no less true, about the year he had carried a fear he never named. The men sat together in the generous kind of silence that made strangers slow down when passing their table, as if they could sense gravity even if they didn't know its source. When the bill came, the friend grabbed it with a theatrical flourish and the man let him, grateful not for the meal but for the way friendship sometimes chose a simple gesture to say, "I'm still here." Outside, the wind lifted the man's scarf, and for a moment, the thin line of the scar flashed like a pale thread. He didn't tuck the scarf back immediately. He let the air touch the healed skin and felt, absurdly and exactly, proud. Late that night, the man woke and walked to the window. The city held its breath between traffic light cycles, the hush that came just before a street turned green again. He placed his fingers lightly over the line at the back of his neck and felt nothing sharp, only the muted echo of a story ending one way and beginning another. He thought, briefly, of the surgeons freezing in shock when they saw what was inside him, and instead of flinching, he found himself whispering, "Thank you," to the empty room, the 2 syllables a small prayer to skill, to timing, to all the hands that had protected what needed protection. The man returned to bed. He lay on his side, drew up his knees, and let sleep find him without argument. Tomorrow would bring work and stretches and a plant that needed water, and he would meet those things as he had met the operation, with attention that didn't call itself bravery. And when strangers asked for directions in a hallway that once frightened him, the man would stand, lift an arm that no longer hurt to lift, and show them the way. On a weekday softened by overcast light, the man walked the perimeter of the hospital garden during his volunteer break and realized he had started measuring time by other people's arrivals. He knew the rhythm now, the early patients who came before the sun and sat with paper cups of coffee balanced on their knees, the mid-morning rush of families who spoke in clipped sentences because the day had suddenly become a sequence of appointments, the quiet afternoons when a person could hear the automatic doors breathe. He stood by a low hedge and rotated his shoulders the way the therapist had taught him, slow arcs that asked more of patience than strength, and felt the steady glide of a joint that had once negotiated every motion like a contract. Inside, he guided a man in a work jacket to radiology and walked alongside a woman who said she hated hospitals because they smelled like endings. They smell like bleach and beginnings, too, he said before he could stop himself, and she smiled as if she had stepped into a slightly warmer room. When he returned to the volunteer desk, he found a small envelope with his name on it, plain handwriting, no return address. Inside lay a thank you note from someone he barely remembered walking to the elevators 2 weeks earlier. "You looked like you knew where to go," the note said. That helped. He folded the card and put it in his wallet as if it were an ID he might need later. At home, the plant with the glossy leaves thrived near the window. He watered it on the days he stretched, a double ritual that made the apartment feel tended. On the table, the man kept his notebook open to a page titled simply, "After," where he wrote down things he wanted to keep, the precise shade of tape the nurse preferred for dressings, the list of questions that made doctors answer in stories instead of jargon, the way grief for a fear you didn't have to carry anymore could arrive like weather weeks after relief. He wrote the name of the tumor again and then underlined the part of the pathology report that had become a quiet comfort, margins clear. At his next physical therapy session, the therapist replaced the resistance band with a slightly firmer one and raised an eyebrow when he grinned like a child seeing a higher swing. She watched his scapula track with each pull and said, "There," when the motion finally looked right without thought. He had not expected pride to be the emotion that lived in the corner of a rehab room, but there it was, clean. Unembarrassed, earned. Afterward, he sat on the curb outside with a bottle of water and texted his sister a photo of the new band as if he had brought home a trophy that fit in his pocket. At work, he accepted a project he would have avoided before, the sort that required meetings he couldn't fully script and decisions he couldn't make alone. He noticed, with a flicker of surprise, that the man who used to guard his time like a bunker now opened it like a door. Javier stopped by his desk and asked if he wanted lunch. They walked to a place that served soup in bowls large enough to qualify as advice. Halfway through, Javier said, "I kept thinking I'd feel like myself again when my knee was exactly like it was before. I don't. I feel like myself with a seam." The man nodded, feeling the words settle into the shared ledger they had been keeping without naming it. On an evening trimmed with wind, he took the long route home and passed a storefront he had ignored for years, a small framing shop that displayed old maps and photographs. On impulse, the man stepped inside. He told the owner he wanted a simple frame for a page that mattered. He unfolded the piece of paper he had printed at home, the paragraph from his pathology report that read like a hinge in a story, diagnosis, description, margins clear. The owner didn't blink at the strangeness. "Float it," she suggested, "so it looks like it's breathing." He said yes, left the page in careful hands, and walked out lighter than he had gone in. A week later, he met Dr. Marin in the hallway between clinics. She had changed into street clothes and carried her bike helmet by the straps. They exchanged the kind of greeting two people earned by moving through a narrow doorway together. She asked how his shoulder felt. He told her the truth, stronger, stubborn in the mornings, quick to forgive if he listened. He almost asked if surgeons remembered the faces of all the people they had opened and closed, then realized the question didn't need saying. She had answered it already, in the way she spoke to him each time as if she were still in the room where the lights ran bright and time sped up. He joined a small hospital class one Saturday, understanding surgical scars, a name so literal he almost laughed. 10 people sat in a circle of mismatched chairs while a nurse explained tissue layers and remodeling like a weather report for bodies. When it came time for questions, a young father asked how to touch his scar without feeling like he might break something. The nurse said, "With clean hands and ordinary kindness." The man wrote that down and circled it. He went home and tried it that night, fingertips light, pressure respectful, and felt, for the first time, curiosity where fear had lived. The man's sister called more often. They had the kind of talk siblings invented after a scare, not the old shorthand of childhood, but a new language that included pauses without apology. She told him about a school fundraiser that went sideways and a neighbor who played trumpet at odd hours and the way she had started carrying peppermints because they calmed worry on the highway. He told her about a woman who cried quietly in a waiting room and about the volunteer who left little paper cranes on the magazines, a flock that grew overnight. They didn't pretend everything had returned to a before that didn't exist. They named what was different and let it stand. On a late afternoon with cloud edges lit like torn cloth, the man walked into the small hospital chapel. He wasn't religious in any organized way, but the quiet felt shaped for the kind of thought he could not do well anywhere else. He sat in the back, staring at a window that caught the gray light and made it orderly. He remembered the sentence from the operative note Dr. Marin had shown him because he had asked to read the facts: intraoperative finding, complex mature elements within encapsulated mass, dissection performed with attention to the accessory nerve. He had loved that last clause more than he could explain, the way it sounded like a promise kept. He stayed until his phone vibrated with a reminder to stand and stretch. He did, chin toward one shoulder, then the other, aware of the odd grace of following instructions written by a stranger's care months earlier. Leaving, he passed a bulletin board full of handwritten notes, names, thanks, please, and felt, not the urge to add one, but the relief of recognizing his life among all the others who had been rearranged and kept going. At his next check-in, Dr. H asked if the man had considered talking to someone who handled the after that medicine often handed back without a manual. The man said he had been writing. Dr. H smiled. That counts, he said. So does sitting with someone in a waiting room. The man understood that counts had begun to mean more than boxes checked. It meant the gentle accumulation of things that steadied him: walks, notes, stretches, calls returned, soup eaten while still hot, threads tied between strangers who had learned each other by the light of a nurse's lamp. He accepted an invitation to speak to a group of nursing students about the patient experience, 15 minutes in a classroom with windows that looked out on a parking lot bordered by a brave, thin maple. He stood at the front, palms open, and told the story with the pieces he thought mattered to people who would move through halls with charts and questions. He described the smell of antiseptic and lemon, the way ceiling tiles could become a prayer, the exact relief of hearing a doctor say, "I won't guess," the way a hand steadying a shoulder before a transfer could feel like a statement about the world. He watched their faces change in small ways and felt the old fear pulse once, asked to be seen, and then settle when he did not hide from it. On a day when wind carried dust high over the street, the man returned to the framing shop and picked up the pathology page. The owner had done exactly as promised, floating, breathing, the words centered in clean glass. He took it home, hung it on the hallway wall not as a trophy but as a compass, and noticed how the light struck it differently as the day moved. He didn't explain it to visitors unless they asked. When they did, he said, "It helped me understand what they took out and what they left. Both matter." He began to run, if running could be defined as a careful conversation between foot and pavement. The first time, he made it 1 block and laughed out loud at how his lungs objected. The second time, 2 blocks. He paid attention to the way his neck liked his shoulders low, his jaw easy. He stopped when a small twinge asked for a truce and walked the rest of the way home without scolding himself. He had once believed progress meant ignoring discomfort. Now progress meant listening early. At the hospital, a woman in a red sweater asked if he had a minute to walk her to pre-op. He did. In the elevator, she stared at the numbers and said, "I'm scared they'll find something no one expects." He didn't reach for the easy joke or the quick platitude. He said, "They did, once, when I was the one on the table." They were surprised, and then they did exactly what training asks them to do. I woke up and learned the name for it. Learning the name helped. She looked at him as if someone had opened a window. What was it? He told her. She nodded as if she had been handed a word she might need later. The man found small ways to leave the places he passed better than he found them. He pushed in chairs. He refilled the water jug at the volunteer desk. He returned a magazine someone had left on the floor to the table and smoothed its bent corner as if smoothing a sheet before sleep. He had not set out to be the kind of person who tended to surfaces, but here he was, caring for edges and angles because they were the parts people reached for when everything else felt unsteady. On a quiet night, rain tidied the air and the city's usual clatter softened. The man stood at the sink and washed the last plate, then leaned his hip against the counter and stared at the reflection in the black window, his face, his shoulder line, the soft shadow where the scar would always be. He pressed 2 fingertips to the line and felt it answer like a road in good repair. He thought of the first time his hand had found the swelling and all the small decisions between then and now, the ignoring and the deciding, the walking in and the lying down, the shock held without panic in a bright room, the long work of after that no one applauded because it lived in ordinary choices. He went to bed with the window cracked and the plant's leaves catching a sheen of streetlight. He lay on his side the way the therapist preferred and counted breaths not as a trick but as a way to visit each moment before it went. In the next room, the framed report hung on the wall like a quiet bell. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see the operating room first or the glint of the scalpel. He saw the volunteers' paper cranes in a tidy flock and the nurse's hands placing clean tape across a healed line and the waiting room clock that kept time for everyone without judgment. The man turned his head, left, then right, met no pain, and smiled into the dark, sure that morning would bring more of the same work he could do: show up, listen, move, rest, repeat, and keep learning what steadiness required from him. He woke on the morning of his final follow-up with the unremarkable steadiness he had worked for. The man shaved carefully around a soft ridge behind his ear, laid the gray scarf across the back of a chair, and stood at the mirror long enough to recognize himself without flinching. He packed his notebook, the list he no longer needed, and left the plant watered and the window cracked for air. On the bus, he watched the city move and felt, with a quiet certainty, that the hospital no longer drew a hard border around his days. It had become a place on a map he could cross without bracing. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and coffee. He greeted the volunteer at the desk by name, a small kindness that made both of them smile. In the exam room, Dr. H came in with the same unhurried attention he had offered since the first day. He checked the scar, the shrug, the turn, the strength against his hand. "That looks excellent," he said, and the man heard the word as if it were a stamp placed gently on everything that had come before. They reviewed the last notes. No tenderness. No drainage. No fever. Full range with only a whisper of morning stiffness that eased by the first cup of coffee. Dr. H closed the chart and rested his palms on the counter. "You did the work," he said. "We met you halfway." Down the hall, Dr. Marin waited with the final release paperwork and the calm of a person who trusted a well-mended line. She traced the path of the accessory nerve with a fingertip over the air the way a teacher traced a river on a map. "If anything changes, redness, firm swelling, fever, you call," she reminded him, but the tone had shifted. The reminder sounded like the last sentence of a chapter that knew its own period. The man thanked her in the unornamented words that fit. He did not tell her about the framed paragraph at home or the days he had walked the garden and translated panic into steps. He didn't need to. She had seen what she needed to see: a healed incision, a steady shoulder, a patient who had learned his own signals. On his way out, he paused at the elevator and saw the woman in the red sweater, the one he had walked to pre-op weeks earlier, standing with a companion and a paper bag of medications. She looked tired and intact. Their eyes met, recognition was brief and warm. She lifted the bag a fraction as if to say, "I made it through," and he nodded as if to answer, "I knew you would." The doors opened. The day moved. Outside, the air carried that clean after-rain smell that rearranged streets into something almost kind. He didn't hurry. He stopped for coffee and faced the window again, the way he had promised himself on a day when facing had felt like a victory. He wrote a single sentence in his notebook: "Cleared, no follow-up needed unless new symptoms," and closed it without underlining or circling. He tucked the notebook away and, for the first time in months, left it there all afternoon. At home, the man took the framed pathology paragraph down from the hallway, wiped a faint arc of dust from the top edge, and hung it 2 inches higher. He stepped back. The glass caught the late sun and made a quiet rectangle of light on the opposite wall, a little window to the day a set of precise words had turned terror into knowledge. He stood in that light for a minute and then moved on, not out of indifference, but because the page had done its job. He returned the gray scarf to the back of the chair and went running, if the careful, respectful pace he had learned could be called that. He made it 3 blocks, then 4. His neck stayed easy. He stopped where the park opened like a held breath and stretched exactly as the therapist had taught him, chin toward one shoulder, then the other, patient arcs that had become a ritual more than a prescription. A boy threw a tennis ball to a dog who ignored every rule of fetch. Somewhere a trumpet practiced scales, the notes drifting across the grass one clean step at a time. He walked home, hands warm, lungs steady. Days slid into a shape that felt honest. He volunteered his 2 hours each week and left chairs aligned and questions answered. He worked without guarding himself the way he once had, and when Javier stopped by with a knee less stubborn than before, the man listened like a person who had learned that bodies made their own calendars and progress did not fear small steps. He spoke to a second set of nursing students and watched the same quiet shift cross their faces when he described the relief of hearing, "I won't guess." He kept the notebook, but he wrote in it less. He watered the plant and moved it an inch to the left when the leaves leaned toward the window. He met his sister for breakfast on a Saturday and laughed at a joke that didn't pretend at comfort, it simply landed in the middle of the table and stayed. She touched the back of his neck once, absent-mindedly, the way family did when they forgot where the careful places had been. He didn't startle. The skin under her fingers held like a story told to the end. On an evening gold enough to feel staged, he took a walk without deciding the route. He turned where the street asked him to, past the framing shop, and saw in the window an old photograph of a bridge under construction, cables half slung, deck incomplete, the work obvious and beautiful. He stared at it longer than he meant to and thought of the months when he, too, had lived in scaffolding. He thought of the surgeons freezing in shock under the bright lights and then working through surprise with skill that did not bend. He thought of the first breath after anesthesia that had felt like the most ordinary miracle. He thought of the small, repetitive work of after, the kind no one saw unless they were doing it. Back home, he stood at the sink washing a plate when the phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Hi, it's the woman you walked to pre-op. They removed the mass. Benign. Thank you, for the elevator conversation." The man smiled and typed back, "I'm glad you're okay." He left it there. The thread did not need more than that to be complete. A few weeks later, he reached the end of his physical therapy plan, graduation day, the therapist joked, handing him the firmer band he had once eyed like a dare. "Keep the form," she said. "You know it now." He thanked her and meant it in the way people meant it when they understood what had been given, time, attention, a way to move through the rest of a life with less fear and more precision. That night, he cooked something simple and good, ate it while it was hot, and cleaned the kitchen without rushing. He opened the album with the picnic photo and added another image, the first run that had felt like running, printed from his phone, date written in a neat hand. He slid the album back onto the shelf, felt the click as it met the wood, and turned off the lamp. The scar itched once, a polite reminder. He touched it with 2 fingers and felt not a warning but a line drawn on a map he could now read. He lay down with the window open to the mild sound of the city. The framed paragraph in the hall caught a slip of streetlight and gave it back, faint and steady. The man breathed in and out, the way the nurse had taught him in pre-op, longer on the exhale. An instruction that had once seemed like a trick and had become a practice. He didn't rehearse the operating room anymore when sleep came. He didn't picture the hair gleaming under lights or the chalky nub or the surgeons holding still in surprise. He remembered instead the ordinary mercies that had held the days together, the weight of a cup in his hands, the feel of shoulders moving without negotiation, the soft scratch of a pen against paper when a question was finally asked in time. He remembered the sentence he had written and underlined once: "When it mattered, I went, and they helped me." It remained true without needing to be rehearsed. When morning arrived, it arrived simply. He got up. He stretched. He watered the plant and stepped into light that didn't ask anything more than what he could give. The swelling on the back of his neck had become a story with an arc and an end, a scar with a purpose, a lesson that did not announce itself as wisdom. The man shouldered his bag, locked the door, and walked out into a day that had no appointment he dreaded and no corridor he feared. He moved through the city with the easy knowledge that attention had saved him and steadiness had carried him the rest of the way. And when a stranger at the hospital asked where radiology was, he pointed with a shoulder that lifted cleanly, smiled without explanation, and said, "I'll show you."